Okay, so today we're gonna dive into something pretty dark.
Yeah.
Andrei Chikatilo.
The Butcher of Rostov.
Yeah, the Red Ripper, the Rostov Ripper.
All of them.
All the Rippers.
Yeah.
And this one is gonna be pretty heavy. I think what we really want to look at is what led to the extreme brutality of his crimes.
Yeah, it is heavy material for sure. And I think it's important right up front, to acknowledge, that we're going to be talking about graphic violence and psychological disturbance and sexual abuse.
Right.
And we're certainly not here to sensationalize any of that stuff.
Right.
Of
course not.
But I think, that this deep dive is really about trying to understand how all these elements came together, right?
Yeah.
To result in these just horrific acts.
Yeah, and just to give everybody a little background, his crime spree spanned over a decade.
Yeah, a long time.
1978 to 1990.
Mm-hmm.
He was officially convicted of 52 murders.
Wow.
But he actually confessed to 56.
Yeah, I mean, who knows how many more there really were, right?
Right, exactly.
But yeah, I mean, that's a huge number.
Yeah. So let's get into it.
Yeah.
What manifested as this just terrifying brutality? Like, what was going on there?
Well, yeah, I mean, the sources, really detail his modus operandi, right?
Mm-hmm.
So his pattern of crime. And, and I think one of the most chilling things is that, this level of violence wasn't like static. It escalated.
It escalated over time.
It got worse. It got more extreme.
Yeah.
Which is just really scary to think about.
So how did this even start, right? Like, how did he find these people?
It's kind of interesting, actually, because initially he really cultivated this image of a harmless guy, just a seemingly unremarkable kind of middle-aged man, quiet, often wearing glasses,
Yeah.
And he would prey on people he knew were vulnerable.
Right.
Runaways, kids, young women that he encountered at train stations and bus depots, places where people are kind of in transit alone, maybe a little lost.
Right.
And, his tactics were pretty deceptive. I mean, he would offer these seemingly innocent things,
Right.
like candy or small gifts or offers of help.
Yeah.
Sometimes he would even pose as, a teacher or someone in a position of authority to gain their trust.
Right.
Which is just so creepy to think about.
Yeah. I mean, to think that he was out there, like, seeking out these vulnerable people and playing on that vulnerability.
Exactly. Taking advantage.
It's really disturbing.
Yeah.
And then, so he gets them alone. What happens next?
Well, that's when things take a really dark turn.
Right.
The sources suggest that there was this turning point where the violence itself, the act of inflicting pain
became the source of his sexual gratification.
Yeah, became the main event. Right.
Wow.
As if the initial deception, the luring
was just a means to an end.
Exactly. It was just a way to get them there to that point.
So he could unleash this violence, and that was the point.
Yeah. And it's as if like the sexual release became intrinsically linked to the stabbing and the mutilation.
It's just so horrific.
Yeah. And it gets even worse when you look at the actual details of what he did.
I don't even know if I want to know, but we have to talk about it.
I know it's hard to hear, but I think it's important to really understand, the extent of what we're dealing with here.
Okay.
So, victims were stabbed dozens of times.
Dozens.
Like
over and over.
Over and over, and often even after death.
What?
Yeah. So, it wasn't even like he was killing them and then doing it. It was like the stabbing itself was part of it.
It was like the act itself.
Yeah. And then there was the genital mutilation, which was really frequent, and the removal of eyes.
Oh, my God.
And there were even documented instances of cannibalism.
Really?
Yeah. So we're talking about the removal and chewing of nipples, tongues, genitals.
That's just unimaginable.
Yeah. And he would bite off other body parts, too. Like seemingly driven by this intense rage, but also this perverse kind of sexual satisfaction.
So it was like a mix of anger and sexual deviancy.
It's like they were all tangled up together.
Yeah.
It's really hard to separate them out.
But it just got worse, right?
Yeah, and in some of the later cases, there was also necrophilia and really extensive post-mortem mutilation.
So it was like he was almost experimenting with different forms of violence.
It seems like, yeah.
And like you said, it was escalating.
It was escalating. Yeah. And to me, that really speaks to something unraveling within him,
He was losing control.
Yeah, like this need for more and more extreme acts suggests like a really profound loss of control.
Right.
Like the earlier levels of violence just weren't enough anymore,
They weren't doing it for him anymore.
Exactly.
So what was going on in his head? Like, what could explain this level of depravity?
Well, the sources point to a number of different diagnoses that could help to shed some light on that. For one thing, he definitely exhibited signs of sexual sadism disorder.
And what is that exactly?
So that involves, recurrent, intense sexual arousal from inflicting suffering on others.
So the pain of others is what turned him on.
Yeah, essentially. He also had, various paraphilias,
Which are
basically, sexual interests that deviate from what's considered to be the norm, including necrophilic tendencies.
So an attraction to corpses.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And there was even some consideration of a schizoid personality disorder.
What is that?
Well, that's characterized by, a detachment from social relationships.
So like a loner type?
Yeah, kind of.
Okay.
And also restricted range of emotional expression.
So like very flat affect.
Yeah, exactly.
Interesting.
And, I think another key factor that keeps coming up in the sources is this deep-seated sense of sexual inadequacy and impotence.
Really?
Yeah, and it's almost as if, his inability to experience normal sexual function
led him to the...
Yeah, like it somehow warped his desires into these unimaginable acts of violence.
Like a substitute.
In a way, yeah.
Wow.
And there's also this recurring theme of intense hatred towards women.
Oh, right, Lee.
Yeah, which, the sources trace back to significant childhood trauma and experiences of humiliation.
So it's like all of this pent-up rage and frustration.
On this outlet.
This monstrous outlet.
Yeah.
Yeah, that makes sense.
And, when we look at his early life, it's really hard not to see potential connections there.
Right. Like, what kind of childhood did he have?
Well, he grew up during the Holodomor.
And what was that?
That was a devastating famine in Ukraine.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, millions of people died.
Died.
So to grow up in that kind of environment.
Must have been unimaginably traumatic.
Yeah, you can't even imagine the psychological impact of that kind of widespread death and desperation.
Right. And was there anything specific in his childhood that might have contributed?
Well, there's a report about his brother's death due to cannibalism.
Oh, my.
Yeah, for a young child to process that kind of event, even if he didn't witness it directly.
That would leave a mark.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
And then on top of that, you have the extreme poverty that he endured.
Right.
He lived in a tiny one-room hut, slept on a straw bed.
So no stability, no security.
None whatsoever.
God.
And then there's the trauma within his own family.
Right.
The sources detail, regular beatings and psychological abuse from his mother.
Oh, my God.
So, that constant fear, that absence of a safe and nurturing environment.
Yeah.
That would definitely leave deep scars.
That's awful.
And there's also this detail about his prolonged enuresis.
What's that?
Bedwetting.
Oh.
Which persisted well into his late teens.
Wow.
You can imagine in a harsh and unforgiving environment, that would be a source of real shame and humiliation.
Absolutely.
And crucially, the development of these violent sexual fantasies seems to have been directly linked to his struggles with sexual performance.
So, it was almost like his mind created this alternative reality.
Yeah, where he could achieve this twisted sense of power and gratification.
Through domination and violence.
Yeah, it's really disturbing to think about.
It is.
But, it's not just about his individual psychology.
Right.
The sources also shed light on the societal context of all of this.
Okay.
And it's almost unbelievable in retrospect.
What do you mean?
Well, so the initial reaction of the Soviet police
to these crimes.
Yeah, they basically flat out denied the possibility of a serial killer operating within their society.
Why?
Because it went against their whole ideology. The Soviet Union was supposed to be this perfect society.
A worker's paradise.
Right, a utopia with no crime.
Right.
So the very idea of a serial killer,
it was unthinkable.
It was inconceivable to them.
Wow.
And this wasn't just passive disbelief,
Right.
The sources suggest that they actively dismissed early reports of multiple similar murders.
As what?
As isolated incidents, just hooliganism.
Wow.
They just refused to acknowledge the possibility of a serial predator because it contradicted their whole worldview.
So their ideology blinded them
completely
to the reality of what was happening.
Yeah, and that led to a disastrous misallocation of resources and missed opportunities to catch him much earlier.
That's tragic.
It really is.
So all these innocent people died
because of this ideological rigidity.
That's just awful.
It's a stark reminder of how powerful beliefs can really distort our perception of reality and lead to terrible consequences.
Right. And it's not just about the police response, right?
No, I mean, the sources also suggest that the social repression that was prevalent in the Soviet Union at the time might have contributed to Chikatilo's own sense of powerlessness.
Interesting.
Like maybe it fueled his need to exert this absolute control over his victims in this really horrific way.
Yeah, it's like he was taking out his frustrations with the system on these innocent people.
It's possible.
God.
Yeah.
So it really seems like it was this just terrifying convergence of factors.
It does, yeah.
You have the childhood trauma, the sexual dysfunction, the societal pressures, the need for control, the paraphilias. It's just a horrifying combination.
It really is a chilling example of how deeply intertwined, individual psychology and broader societal factors can be.
And how that can lead to unimaginable darkness.
Exactly.
So what happened to him in the end?
Well, he was eventually caught and tried and convicted
Yeah.
and sentenced to death.
Wow.
Yeah.
So at least he didn't get away with it.
No, but, the damage was done.
Of course.
And it's important to note that this case did have a lasting impact.
In what way?
Well, it led to significant reforms within the Russian criminal justice system.
Oh, good.
Yeah. And it also marked an early, albeit tragically delayed success for the development and application of criminal profiling techniques in the Soviet Union.
So it was a turning point in a way.
It was.
Wow.
And, this case continues to hold a dark fascination for people.
Yeah, I can see why.
It has inspired numerous books, films, documentaries.
Like what?
Like Citizen X Evelenko, The Red Ripper. Each trying to grapple with the sheer scale and horror of his crimes.
Right. It's like we're trying to understand how something like this could even happen.
Exactly.
So what can we learn from all of this?
Well, I think this deep dive into Chikatilo's case, it compels us to confront the most disturbing aspects of human nature.
For sure.
And to really consider the complex origins of violence.
Right.
It's not a simple answer. It's a combination of factors.
So where does that leave us?
I think it leaves us with a really important question to consider. Given this terrifying interplay of psychological factors, societal context, and early life trauma.
What does this case ultimately reveal about the darkest capacities within human beings?
Yeah, and maybe even more importantly, what does it tell us about the critical need to understand the roots of violence?
In all its forms.
Yeah, so that we might, in some way, prevent such unimaginable tragedies in the future.
That's a lot to think about.
It is.
Well, thanks for taking us on this difficult but important deep dive.
Yeah, of course. Thanks for having me.
And to all our listeners out there, thank you for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
See you later.